Well, hey there, friends. I'm your host, Penny, and this is Criminally Nerdy. Hello, beautiful humans. I hope you all had wonderful holidays. Whether you have children or not, I'm willing to bet that every one of you can understand just how deeply I mean it when I say fuck whoever does packaging for toys. Yeah. If you're the person who decided that it should take 20 minutes, scissors, a screwdriver, new batteries, 3 drops of blood from a deity, and a charger for one toy, I'm billing you for my next therapy session. Anyways, I hope everyone listening got everything their hearts desired. You lovelies deserve the world. I also hope that somewhere in the madness of the season, you found moments of peace. They can be few and far between in the chaos of cleaning and cooking and wrapping and traveling, so if you didn't get the chance to find any yet, go do that now. Stop what you're doing and go meditate. Eat some ice cream. Take a nap. Whatever you need, make it happen. Your to-do list isn't going anywhere. Speaking of to-do lists, did anyone make New Year's resolutions, or have we given those up? I mean, I did make a couple. I resolved to get witchier, weirder, queerer, and maybe exercise, but I'm not super sold on that last one. In podcast world, I wanted to say, first and foremost, thank you all so much for a fantastic year. We started our journey together in mid-March, and though we're in 2025 now, this was the last episode written for 2024. I'm sorry it's so late, I hate it, but some things just can't be avoided. I could have never imagined the overwhelming support that would follow. From listeners, friends, family, and even other amazing podcasters. Through the ups and the downs, the word grateful doesn't do justice to the way I feel about all of you and this journey so far. In addition to making content that I am passionate about and confident in delivering to you, I am committed to taking Criminally Nerdy to the next level this year. That being said, the show will be taking a little break while I try to get my ducks in a row. As you've noticed, we've gone from weekly to every other week, and now to just getting them out whenever I'm able. And my anxiety does not like that. At all. And that is not what I want you all to expect. It may be hard to believe, but though the episodes these past couple of months have been scarce, I have worked on them every spare minute I'm able. Truth be told, I started this thing out taking a leap without knowing where the hell I was going to land. Thankfully, I've landed among the most fantastic people in the world. You all. And for you, I'm going to continue working and building some much-needed infrastructure to ensure that you can expect some more stability from the show in 2025. I can't say exactly when we'll be back, but trust me, I'm not going anywhere. Make sure you're following the podcast on your favorite listening app, drop a 5-star, and keep an eye out on social media for updates. I shout those out at the end of the show, and I will make sure to link them in the show notes for this episode. We haven't come this far to only go this far, so onward and upward we go. This episode is airing on January 6th, which is National Take Down the Christmas Tree Day, National Cuddle Up Day, and Kate McKinnon's birthday. So, call into work. Your boss isn't allowed to have a problem because your PTO just refilled, so you've got it to spare. Take down your damn Christmas tree because you'll feel so much better with that task tackled. Reward yourself by cuddling up and watching Kate McKinnon do literally anything. I would give recommendations here, but honestly, she can do no wrong. Ever. If you need a place to start, go look up her SNL Close Encounter skits. But, pro tip, do not watch them if you've already indulged in a treat that contains hippie calories and you enjoy breathing, because you cannot do both. So I've heard. I mentioned in part 1 that this case was recommended by many, most recently, my dad. I wanted to give him another shout out in today's episode. Thank you, Dad, for the recommendation, cheering me on, and even contributing in unexpected ways. Today, we come to the conclusion of our 3-part dive into the case of Ed Kemper, also known as the Ed Killer, one of the nation's most notorious serial killers. In episode 1, we set the tone for what life was like in Santa Cruz in the early 1970s as it became clear that a violent, sadistic killer was on the loose. When the killer, in a shocking turn of events, turned himself in seemingly out of the blue, the world was left to wonder, who the hell is Ed Kemper? In episode 2, we discussed his early life and crimes with little insight from Ed himself. Today, we will discuss the whys covered in his multiple confessions detailing the heinous acts of violence he committed and how his willingness to divulge details about not only his crimes, but what drove him to commit them would change the way serial killers are profiled to this day. I'm giving a very heavy trigger warning for this episode as we will be discussing the graphic nature of Ed's crimes, which will include sexual assault, murder, mutilation, necrophilia, and cannibalism. He not only gave a detailed confession, but also cooperated with multiple interviews through the years. When recounting what happened with his victims, I will be combining the details gathered from those interviews to be succinct. Please be cautioned that overall, this episode will be heartbreakingly brutal. Some of my sources for this case were crimelibrary.org, the New York Post, the Santa Cruz Sentinel, EdmundKemperStories.com, the book Edmund Kemper, The True Story of the Ed Killer by Jack Rosewood, the ID docuseries Mind of a Monster, The Ed Killer, and the podcast Serial Killers. I do have one correction to make from my previous episode. I said that Ed's appointment with his court-appointed psychiatrist was on November 29, 1972, at which point his juvenile record was expunged. That was incorrect. His actual appointment was on September 15, 1972, but the records were not officially sealed until about 2.5 months later after the paperwork had been processed. On Monday, April 21, 1973, Detective Mickey Aluffi awoke early to a startling call that a local man, 24-year-old Ed Kemper, had called the Santa Cruz PD to confess that he had killed his mother. Upon investigation, it was discovered that he had not only killed his mother, 52-year-old Clarnell Strandberg, but he had also killed her best friend, 59-year-old Sally Hallett. Inside of the home, investigators found a handwritten confession and items that linked Ed to a series of murders of local young women that until this point had left them baffled. Inside of Ed's vehicle that he had left at the home he shared with his mother, they found a bullet embedded in the right rear panel of the car, a blood-stained knife, bloodstains in and underneath the back seat, a shovel, red dishpan, and strands of hair in the trunk. They later found his mother's car parked on a nearby street, while Sally Hallett's car was missing. Ed was arrested without incident in Pueblo, Colorado, which came as a shock to arresting officer 30-year-old David Martinez. A search of the vehicle that the 6'9", 280-pound man had been driving revealed a knife in the glove box, a shotgun, 2 rifles, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition, making it appear that he had been prepared to go down in a blaze of gunfire. He had already begun his confession by telling Santa Cruz PD officer Jim Connor that he had killed his mother, her best friend, and 6 additional women. With the Pueblo County PD, he continued with some of the details. However, he wanted to give his full confession to Detective Aluffi. Detective Aluffi agreed and made his way to Colorado. When he arrived, he spoke with Ed for somewhere between 4 and 6 hours, during which time Ed matter-of-factly recounted the grisly murders of Marianne Pesch, Anita Luchessa, Aiko Koo, Cynthia Shaw, Rosalind Thorpe, Allison Liu, Clarnell Strandberg, and Sally Hallett. But before we can move forward with those details, we are first going to have to go back. In episode 2, we learned that in his childhood, Ed faced serious verbal and physical abuse at the hands of his mother. To cope with the rejection, anger, and isolation he felt, Ed began to retreat into a fantasy world. At a very early age, his fantasies became violent and only grew increasingly more sadistic as he got older. These fantasies and violent tendencies eventually spilled over into reality, first with family pets, and escalating tragically to the senseless murders of his grandmother Maud and grandfather Edmund Sr. when he was just 15 years old. After turning himself in for the murder of his grandparents, Ed was incorrectly diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, allowing him to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. The plea was successful, and instead of being sent to prison, Ed was sent to California's maximum security mental health facility, Atascadero State Hospital. Atascadero, often referred to as California's Hospital for the Criminally Insane, had a ratio of only one psychiatrist for every 160 inmates. Amidst all the violence and depravity, Ed captured the attention of the staff, not only because he literally stood out due to his 6'5" frame at the age of only 15, but also because he was a model prisoner and remarkably intelligent. Over the years, he ingratiated himself with the staff. He was an impressive young man in their eyes, so they took a special interest in his case. He was reevaluated, during which time they discovered that not only was Ed not suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, but he also had an IQ of 145, placing him in the near genius range. His diagnosis was changed to passive-aggressive personality disorder, or PAPD, something that his doctors were confident they could not only treat, but cure. They began by assigning Ed simple tasks around the facility, eventually allowing him to work alongside them. He would sit in on interviews, administer and score tests, and transport confidential patient files from office to office. The doctors were proud of the progress they saw in Ed, but what he was truly excelling at was what he was able to keep them from seeing. Later interviews with Ed revealed that while the doctors were right about his intelligence, they overlooked the fact that his brilliance lay in concealing his true self, a monster laying in wait. The only tool at Ed's disposal was his mind, and he was sharpening it with the information he gathered from the other inmates. He spent his formative and impressionable years surrounded by arsonists, violent sex offenders, and murderers. One of the things he learned from the sex offenders was that their victims were very persuasive in trying to convince their captors to let them go. Many of those incarcerated were there because their victims succeeded, and these monsters often said that their mistake was not killing them. Ed internalized this and knew that should he ever turn his fantasies into reality again, his victims would not escape alive. He observed how they answered doctors' questions and noted how this impacted their treatment and chances for release. When transporting files, he would memorize the answers given on questionnaires and quickly discern what the right answers were. And for Ed, the right answers were whatever would get him out of Atascadero. Believing that he had been cured, Ed was released. The truth, however, was that Ed had successfully hidden from every one of his doctors that his tendency to retreat into his fantasy world had never stopped. If anything, his fantasies had become increasingly intricate, sexual, and sadistic. Try as he may to lead a normal life once he was released, the abuse he suffered at the hands of his mother, coupled with a lifetime of violent urges, were bound to erupt in brutal fashion. One of the many factors that played into his eventual explosion was that he was incredibly intimidated by women. When he was released at the age of 21, not only had he never dated a woman, but he had no experience or skill when it came to just talking to them, making him feel inferior and view women as unattainable objects. We touched on the fact that Ed liked to take long drives in our last episode. The truth was, those early drives were somewhat of a rehearsal for him. Sometime in 1971, Ed began picking up hitchhikers, later admitting that he worked very hard to appear sane. He used the rides with strangers as practice in making small talk and appearing charming, while also taking note of how riders would respond to the things he would do and say. One of the things he would do was take wrong turns that led to secluded areas and then pretend that he had just gotten lost. This was his way of gauging how far he could push the boundaries of a stranger's trust. Over a 2 to 3 year span, he picked up over 200 hitchhikers. He also slowly built his murder kit, adding one item at a time, ranging from plastic bags, hunting knives, handcuffs, and blankets. He kept a 9mm pistol under his seat and would practice jamming the passenger side door by placing a tube of chapstick under the handle so that it could not be opened from the inside. Eventually, Ed would build up enough confidence to move away from rehearsal and turn his fantasies into reality. These days, we know it's common for criminals to try and insert themselves into investigations, but that was a foreign concept at the time Ed was throwing back beers and shots of tequila along investigators at the jury room, as we discussed in our last episode. What we didn't dive into was Ed's true motivation. In later interviews, Ed admitted that while his relationship with law enforcement was somewhat exaggerated during the time of his crimes, he did catalog the information from the cases they were discussing and took note of how police approached their investigations. He would later get a thrill from being right there with them while they discussed the crazed butcher on the loose, all while knowing he was the one they were searching for. Ed hid his intelligence and intentionally played the role of being a bit of an oaf, using the casual friendships he had formed to learn about their theories and the progress they were making. Now that we have a full picture of who he was and how he was operating, we can move forward with how this all culminated, as he described in his confessions. I am going to give a blanket warning that discussions will be incredibly disturbing and graphic from this point on. 23-year-old Ed was living with his roommate in Alameda when on May 7, 1972, he got into an explosive argument with his mother over the phone. He was enraged by the incident and decided that it was finally time to act on the violent and sexual urges he was having, which he referred to as his inner demons. How original. Get so fucked, you actual demon. He had already decided that he wanted to target co-eds, a term used for female college students, because his mother worked at UC Santa Cruz, so university students were his mind's twisted way of coming closer to taking out his anger on her. He drove to California University in Fresno, determined that his next passenger would be his first victim. To his surprise, he found not one, but 2 women searching for a ride. He picked up Mary Ann Pesch and Anita Lucchesa, both 18 years old, at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Mary Ann sat in the front passenger seat and Anita sat in the back. He quickly realized that they were not familiar with the area, so he immediately began driving in the wrong direction and even circling around while thinking of where he wanted to take them. Neither seemed to notice and simply chatted about their lives while asking Ed about his. He was still working with the Division of Highways and showed off his radio transmitter. The girls seemed at ease and even joked that Ed was probably an undercover cop. He said that he felt like this may have given them a false sense of security. The reporting varies here, some saying he took the women to Hayward Hills, some saying he took them to a small town named Livermore. Either way, when he came to a remote area, he parked the car and pulled out the gun he had been keeping under his seat. He pointed the gun at Mary Ann, who he said was surprisingly calm, while Anita was terrified. Ed admitted that he was terrified too, but he knew he was past the point of no return. Mary Ann remained composed and told him that she was willing to talk him through whatever was troubling him. Though he admitted he admired her efforts, because of his time at Atascadero and extensive studying of other criminals, he knew that she was trying to appear sympathetic to gain control of the situation and convince Ed to let them go. Ed had no such plans, but he cruelly played along. He told the women that he only planned to rape them and then he would let them go. He felt that Mary Ann would be easier to control, so while holding the women at gunpoint, he placed one of the handcuffs on her and instructed her to clasp the other around her seatbelt while ordering Anita into the trunk. While walking Anita to the trunk, he looked through the window and noticed that Mary Ann had not latched the other cuff. He yelled at her that if she did not listen to him, things would end badly for her friend. His tactic worked, and Mary Ann snapped the handcuff closed. Ed proceeded to put Anita into the trunk while taking out a plastic bag, knife, and a cloth robe belt from his kill kit. He closed the trunk and went back to Mary Ann. He grabbed her arm and forced her face down on the car seat. In doing so, he accidentally brushed against her breast and found himself so embarrassed that he awkwardly apologized. Which, way to be self-aware that touching someone else's body without consent is not acceptable. But maybe keep going with those feelings instead of the homicidal ones. Pushing past his fumble, he placed the bag over her head. Ed still wanted her to believe that he only intended to rape her, so he assured her that it was only to muffle her voice because he didn't want anyone to hear if she screamed. Mary Ann quickly realized that he was, indeed, trying to kill her when he pulled out the cloth belt and began to tighten it around her neck. Thinking fast, she chewed a hole through the bag so that she could breathe. He pulled so hard that the rope broke, but figured between the bag and his grip, he had gotten the job done. When he turned her around and realized what she had done, he became enraged that she had outsmarted him. Fuming, he took out his knife and stabbed her once in the side and once in the stomach before grabbing her by the chin, holding her head back, and slitting her throat. He said that he was dazed after this, but knew that he needed to pull himself together because he wasn't done. He still needed to kill Anita. When he opened the trunk, she began panicking when she saw that he was covered in blood. He tried to calm her down by saying that he had punched Mary Ann and given her a bloody nose, and that was where the blood had come from. He told her that she could go check on her friend, and as Anita began to climb out of the trunk, Ed again pulled out his knife. He said that she fought hard, but she was no match for him. He stabbed her repeatedly in the chest, forearms, throat, and eyes. He would later say that stabbing them was very messy and likely part of the reason he changed his method of killing. After killing the two, he put both of their bodies in the trunk and began driving home. While making his way back to the apartment, he was actually pulled over for a broken taillight, but was let off with a warning. He later admitted that if the officer had asked to search the vehicle, he would have killed him. He had gone too far now, and he had no plans of stopping. It was dark by the time he returned home, and his roommate was not there, so he moved both women's bodies inside. Once home and alone with the women, he photographed, decapitated, and then proceeded to have sex with their deceased bodies. Afterwards, he dismembered them and used their skulls to perform oral sex on himself. Ed was obsessed with women's decapitated heads, saying it was because it gave him total control over them. He placed the pieces of their dismembered bodies into separate plastic bags and disposed of them by scattering them in the remote areas of the Loma Prieta Mountains, where Mary Ann's skull would later be found on August 15th. Ed found himself thinking of Mary Ann often. He had kept her driver's license as a trophy and would pull it out to look at her face from time to time. He even went so far as to drive past the address listed. The murders and subsequent stalking of Marianne's home seemed to satisfy his urges for a while. But in the 4 months since the murders, Ed had lost his job and was drinking his money away. The nightmare scenario of having to move back in with his mother was looming closer, and Ed found himself unable to control himself any longer. On September 14, 1972, he picked up 15-year-old Aiko Ku, who was on her way to dance class. He asked if she would like a ride, and she agreed. Ed said they made small talk and that Aiko didn't seem to suspect anything was out of the ordinary until he pulled into the entrance of a forest. It was now dark, and she didn't recognize any of her surroundings. He again pulled out the gun, but wanting to keep her from panicking, told her that he had planned to kidnap her, kill her, and then kill himself, but then explained that after talking to her, he had decided he was only going to kill himself and simply wanted to spend his last hours having someone to talk to. Ed said that she was kind and talked to him about the depression he claimed to be suffering from for about 2.5 hours. At that point, he was certain she wouldn't run out of sympathy, and because he had pulled into an area where there really wasn't anywhere for her to run other than into a dark forest. Feeling confident, he left her in the car to go get tape from his trunk. And he was right. She sat in the passenger seat and waited patiently for him to return. When he went to get back in the car, he realized that he had locked himself out, leaving Aiko inside with the keys to the car and the gun. Instead of panicking, he used the skills he had acquired over hundreds of hours of rides with strangers to convince her to let him back in. Now, you're probably screaming to yourself, "Girl, what? Shoot his ass. Take the car. Flee." But let's put ourselves in her shoes for a minute. She was a very smart young woman, but she was only 15 years old. We don't know if she knew how to drive or shoot a gun. Ed, on the other hand, was older and highly skilled at hiding who he really was, so she likely had no idea that he was an extremely dangerous person. He had perfected the skill of being manipulative to the point that multiple physicians deemed him to be cured. So in that moment, she did what she thought was right. And you're never wrong for doing what you think is right. Unfortunately, for her kindness, she paid the ultimate price. She let him back in, and Ed proceeded to choke her until she was unconscious. He then raped her before strangling her to death. After putting her body in the trunk, he decided to go to the bar. This fucking guy. Ugh. He later admitted that when he left the bar, he opened the trunk to look at her, quote, admiring his catch like a fisherman. I am vibrating with rage. Once back at his apartment, he proceeded to photograph, have sex with, decapitate, and dismember her. The next morning, he buried some of her remains throughout various secluded areas, but kept her head for reasons I don't think I need to spell out for you. With her decapitated skull in his trunk, he proceeded to attend his court-appointed psychiatrist appointment, during which time he was so convincing that he was a rehabilitated man that the doctor recommended his juvenile records be sealed. Another testament to just how exceedingly manipulative he was. Ed was feeling like a free man for the first time in his life, but still being jobless, his financial situation forced him to have to move back in with his mother in December of 1972. Aside from the resentment they felt for each other, both Clarnell and Ed were drinking heavily, so their explosive arguments resumed almost immediately. Facing his failures, feeling inferior, and filled with rage, Ed, now 24 years old, knew that he would soon need to satisfy his dumbass inner demons again, so he purchased 2 pistols, a .22 and a .44, and waited for his next opportunity. On January 7th, 1973, Ed was driving around the Cabrillo College campus when he noticed 18-year-old Cindy Shaw. She accepted the ride from the unassuming young man, and Ed immediately put on his charming facade, engaging in small talk, all while driving in no distinct direction, looking for the place where he would kill her. He stopped in the isolated hills of Watsonville, pulled the pistol from under his seat, and ordered her into his trunk. Once inside, he shot her in the head, killing her instantly. Upon returning home, he waited until his mother went to bed, went back outside, and carried Cindy's body to his room where he hid her in his closet. After his mother left for work the next morning, he removed her from the closet and proceeded to have sex with her corpse. He then decapitated and dismembered her. This being the first time he had shot someone, he removed the bullet from her skull so that it would not be traced back to him. But, bewilderingly, he kept some of the evidence very close to home. He disposed of her body parts in the same way he had with the past victims, but kept her head for several days, again, for reasons I don't need to explain. Reporting varies on his reason for disposing of Cindy's skull when he did, one being that her remains had been found and he was panicking, so he wanted to get rid of it fast. Others say it was because her skull was beginning to decompose. Whatever the case may be, Ed decided to bury it in his mother's garden, facing up at her bedroom window. His reason for choosing this spot was because Ed said his mother, quote, always wanted people to look up at her. Unlike the others, Cindy's remains, aside from her head and right hand, were found almost immediately. Fear and speculation were running rampant all over Santa Cruz, with law enforcement now having to admit that there was indeed a serial killer on the loose. Ed admitted that he enjoyed the fear he had inflicted on the community, and knowing that the police had no leads or evidence to point in his direction made him feel powerful. As you may recall, I asked you in our first episode to remember that law enforcement, the media, and local college campuses urged students not to hitchhike, but they were met with resistance. In an effort to combat this, UC Santa Cruz advised that if students were going to hitchhike, they should only accept rides from those with an official campus parking sticker. Unfortunately, this backfired because unbeknownst to law enforcement, their killer had one of those stickers. Reporting varies on why Clarnell got the sticker for Ed, some saying it was so that he could pick her up, some saying it was so she could use his car to drive to campus if she needed, and others say that he asked her for one so that he could have access to the university library. Either way, Ed had that parking sticker, which gave unsuspecting hitchhikers a false sense of security when accepting a ride from him. After yet another verbal battle with his mother on February 5th, 1973, Ed left the house filled with rage and determined to take it out on his next innocent victim. It was raining when he arrived at the UC Santa Cruz campus and first encountered 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe. She usually rode her bike, but decided to take the bus that day because of the weather. She was leaving a lecture, and when she saw the sticker, she accepted the ride so that she wouldn't have to walk to the bus stop in the rain. Just before leaving campus, Ed spotted 20-year-old Alice Liu, who had just finished doing some research and was leaving the library. Seeing what she assumed to be 2 other students, Alice also accepted the ride. This time, Ed's urges were so overwhelming that he could not wait to get to a secluded area before carrying out his plan. He didn't even stop the car. He just slowed down and shot Rosalind sitting in the front seat, in the head at point-blank range, and opened fire on Alice in the back. Rosalind died immediately, and Alice was critically wounded. Ed pulled over the car and shot Alice in the head for a second time, killing her. He then wrapped them in blankets, placed them in the trunk, and drove home. Once back at his mother's home in Apatos, he boldly opened the trunk and decapitated both women right there. He said that if anyone had been passing by or looking out their windows, he would have been caught on the spot, but no one had. After his mother went to sleep, he brought one of the women's bodies inside and slept with her in his bed. The next day, when his mother left for work, he brought the other woman's body inside. He again removed the bullets, had sex with both of their corpses, dismembered, and disposed of them. It only took a week for some of their remains to be found in Eden Canyon. Their skulls were later found in San Mateo County near Route 1 on March 4th. Not long after the discovery of their skulls, Ed realized that his reign of terror could be coming to an end because law enforcement was closing in. After finding record of his .44 caliber firearm purchase, Detective Mickey Alufi and his partner Don Smith showed up at Ed's home to confiscate the weapon, as he was not allowed to be in the possession of a gun due to his prior conviction of a double homicide. Ed, who had recently become engaged, fully cooperated and told them that the weapon was in his trunk. He took them outside and handed it over willingly, but admitted that if the two detectives had been standing together instead of standing on opposite sides of the vehicle, basically surrounding him, he was thinking of killing them. He also admitted that if they had looked a little closer, he would have been arrested on the spot because he not only had his .22 underneath the driver's seat of his car, but also had several items linking him to the missing and murdered women inside his home. Ed said that when they seized his gun, he knew it was time to, quote, blow it and run. And that is when he decided it was time for his final act. The one person he directed all of his fury at. The one he blamed for every problem. The one he had been fantasizing about killing for as long as he could remember. His mother, Clarnell. On Good Friday, April 20th, 1973, Clarnell returned home after attending a party. She was in bed reading a book when Ed came in. Their last exchange, per his taped confession, was Clarnell saying, "Oh, I suppose you want to talk," which Ed said wasn't uncommon. Oftentimes she would come home and he would sit and talk with her before she went to bed. He said that she didn't say this in an abusive type of way, but as more of a joke. Ed told her no, and Clarnell said, "Well, we'll talk in the morning," to which Ed responded, "Fine, good night," and left. He had decided that this was the night he was going to kill her. He went to his room and smoked cigarettes, waiting for her to fall asleep. Once he was sure, around 5:15 in the morning, now Saturday, April 21st, he went into her room with a claw hammer and the same knife he had used to kill Mary Ann Pesch. He stood over her for 2 to 3 minutes before brutally smashing the hammer down onto her right temple. After just one hit, he dropped the hammer and slit her throat. He then sliced all the way around her neck, cutting off her head. He claimed that the whole attack took less than 1 minute, possibly as little as 20 seconds. But it was nowhere near enough to satisfy his rage. He proceeded to humiliate her corpse. From what I could find, he has never explicitly said if he had sex with her corpse or her severed head, but it is heavily insinuated that one or both occurred. He then cut out her tongue and vocal cords in a macabre last attempt to shut her up, and tried to put them down the garbage disposal. The disposal could not break down the tissue, so it was spat back into the sink. Of this, Ed said, quote, "That seemed appropriate, as much as she'd bitched and screamed and yelled at me over so many years." He then put her head on a shelf and screamed at it for hours until his throat was hoarse, and even threw darts at it. However, the book, The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crimes, by authors Michael H. Stone and Gary Brucato, released in 2019, claimed that a source close to the investigation in 1973 said he used his mother's genitals, not her head, as a dartboard, which could be what he meant when he said he humiliated her corpse. When he was done screaming and throwing darts, he smashed in her face, placed her body in her closet, and proceeded to do his second favorite thing, go to a bar and get drunk. While there, Ed played scenarios through his head. He had gone to great lengths to avoid being caught, but he knew that when his mother didn't show up for work on Monday, it would be a huge red flag and people would come looking for her. He needed to get out of town, or maybe even the country, but to do that, he needed to buy himself some time. That is when her best friend and colleague, Sally Hallett, came to his mind. Yes, it would be cause for concern if Clarnell didn't show up for work on Monday. But if both Clarnell and Sally missed a few days, everyone would just assume they had gone on one of their girls' trips. Ed went home and called Sally to invite her over for dinner and a movie as a little surprise get-together for Clarnell. Sally thought it was a sweet idea and agreed to join. When she arrived on the evening of Saturday, April 21st, Ed invited her in, and almost immediately after shutting the door, placed his arms around her neck and strangled her to death. He said she never saw it coming. He then decapitated her and placed her in the front hall closet. Now that he'd bought himself some time, he cleaned up, took all of the money he could find, left his note, and moved his mother's car to another street so no one would think she was home. He then fled in Sally's car with his guns, knife, and ammunition. He had already decided that if he got pulled over, it was going to end in a shootout. He began driving east, taking no-dose caffeine pills to stay alert. He stopped in Nevada to leave Sally's car and get a rental, thinking that before long a manhunt would be on and her car would get him spotted. Again, convinced there was a manhunt out for him, he stuck to back roads and tried to keep a low profile. He would scan the radio as he was driving and check newspapers at gas stations, assuming that the discovery of his mother and Sally's murders would be making headlines. But there was nothing. No one had found them yet. He continued driving and almost slipped up when he stopped for a beer in Lamar, Colorado. He got into an altercation with another man, but decided to just finish his beer and keep driving. By the time he made it to Pueblo, he had driven over 1,000 miles in 28 hours. Seeing that there was still no news, Ed gave up. He pulled over at a phone booth and called the Santa Cruz PD to turn himself in. Among the many questions there were to be asked, the first was why he turned himself in. To this, Ed said, quote, "The original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real or emotional purpose. It was just a waste of time. Emotionally, I couldn't handle it much longer. Toward the end there, I started feeling the folly of the whole damn thing, and at the point of near exhaustion, near collapse, I just said to hell with it and called it off." In other words, his ultimate goal was to kill his mother, the person he blamed for his inferiority complex, the reason he hated women, the reason he was who he was. She was the symbol of everything he saw as wrong, and he had destroyed it. In regards to his utterly despicable acts of decapitation, necrophilia, and sexual acts with his victims' skulls, Ed has had much to say. He has said, quote, "While alive, women were unavailable to me. When dead, they're mine." And has also said, quote, "That's when she's a trophy, because the prettiest part of a woman's body is her head." Though he may be most famously known for saying, quote, "When I see a pretty girl walking down the street, I think two things. One part of me wants to take her home, be real nice, and treat her right. The other part wonders what her head would look like on a stick." When asked why he chose the 6 women he killed out of the over 200 he had picked up over the years, Ed explained that some were just practice, while others were because there were too many people around and he didn't want to get caught. He also said that after word had begun to spread about hitchhikers going missing, if a woman even mentioned the disappearances, he would let her go. He never specified why, only that he, quote, "couldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole." After his arrest, his fiancée, who we are calling Nancy out of respect for her privacy, broke off their engagement. She and her family were in shock. Now that Ed's crimes had been exposed to the world, she went into seclusion. She was in her senior year of high school, but because of her understandably fragile state, her school excused her from exams but did allow her to graduate with her class. When investigators searched his home, they found a photo of her framed in Ed's room. When speaking of Nancy, Ed said that he did love her and that she was, quote, "very much the reason I surrendered." He admitted that he worshipped her and thought of her almost religiously, whatever that means. He confided that the two were never intimate. In fact, he had only had what he referred to as regular intercourse, aka consensual sex with a living woman, once, but he was unable to climax, and the woman rejected any future encounters with him. Now that he had given his confession, it was time for Ed to return to California to face the music. Detective Alufi personally drove him back, stopping in Nevada to retrieve Sally Hallett's vehicle. When they reached California, Ed agreed to show them the locations he had disposed of his victims, and they were able to locate partial remains of Aiko Koo, Marianne Pesch, and Anita Luchessa, as well as the skull of Cindy Shaw buried in his backyard. On May 7, 1973, Ed was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder and assigned to Chief Public Defender Jim Jackson. Because of his lengthy and detailed confession, their only option was to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. While awaiting trial, he was incarcerated at the San Mateo County Jail and evaluated by 3 different court-appointed psychiatrists to determine whether or not Ed was sane at the time he committed his crimes. During one of his many evaluations, Ed was given sodium amytal, or truth serum, to see if there was anything he was suppressing. After the serum was administered, Ed confessed that he ate parts of his victims' bodies. He said that he cut little chunks of meat from their thighs and kept them frozen for a while before putting them in a casserole and eating it. His explanation for this was that eating parts of his victims helped satisfy his urge to kill, and that it brought back the erotic feelings he craved and was only able to achieve at the time of the murders. He later recanted the claims of cannibalism during his 1998 parole hearing. All 3 doctors found him to be sane using the McNaughton rule, which boils down to whether or not a defendant knew what they were doing at the time of committing a crime, and if they knew what they were doing was wrong. Ed clearly knew what he was doing and that it was wrong. He went to great lengths to conceal his crimes in order to avoid being caught and facing justice. In fact, one of his doctors testified that Ed was not only fully cognizant of his actions, but enjoyed the infamy associated with being a serial killer. In further attempts to avoid accepting his fate, Ed twice attempted suicide by slicing his wrist, once before and once during his trial, but both attempts failed. Ed's trial began on October 23, 1973, overseen by Judge Harry Brower. His sister Allen testified for the defense, saying that Clarnell would verbally strip him down. She said, quote, "There's a point you don't push people past, but she would always go past that point with Ed." Allen also said that Clarnell seemed to be suffering from a deep depression that got so intense that she was barely able to keep her position at UC Santa Cruz. Under cross-examination by District Attorney Peter Chang, Allen admitted that she and her mother were concerned that Ed may have been involved with Cindy's death. Allen testified that she had asked Ed directly and that his response was, quote, "No, but I was afraid you might be suspicious because of the cat thing. My mother has already asked me about it, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't bring it up again because it will just stir things up." She also admitted that Ed had always been fascinated by guns and that he had almost killed her once when they were living in Montana. She was walking by and heard a click and then something whiz by her ear. When she looked, a bullet was lodged into the bookcase. She said Ed's only response was, "Oops, I thought it was empty." When his confession tapes were played for the jury, Ed became so distraught that the judge allowed him to be excused, though he later had to return and was forced to hear the rest of his own sick, twisted words echo off the walls of the courtroom. There is nothing fun about this story, but I couldn't help but get a little smirk when I found out that during Ed's trial, a young woman who knew Alice Liu was among the spectators while his confession tapes were being played. When he scanned around the crowd, he made eye contact with her and she made a throat-slitting gesture at him. This upset him so much that he told his lawyer, who relayed the information to the judge. The judge called for a short recess while the bailiff searched for the woman, but claimed they couldn't find her. Many years later, a woman would admit that she was the one who made the gesture, and that in truth, the bailiff did find her in her cute little polka dot dress, but simply asked her to move to the other side of the courtroom because she was upsetting Mr. Kemper. So, yeah, big bad Ed Kemper is nothing more than a little bitch who can dish it, but sure as shit can't take it. He took the stand in his own defense on November 1st, claiming that he had killed his victims because he wanted them for himself as possessions. In another attempt to prove he was insane, he also claimed that his body was inhabited by two different beings and that when the killer personality took over, the gentle giant version of Ed blacked out. His trial concluded on November 8, 1973. The jury of 6 men and 6 women agreed with the doctors and the prosecution, finding him sane and guilty on all 8 counts of first-degree murder. Ed requested the death penalty, but California had abolished capital punishment in 1972, meaning that Ed was going to have to live with every single one of his demons while serving his 8 life sentences at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. During his time in prison, Ed has been housed with many other notorious killers, such as Herbert Mullen, Charles Manson, and David Berkowitz. Ed tried in 1976 and 1977 to be allowed to undergo a lobotomy in an attempt to curb his violent tendencies. At the time, Dr. Hunter Brown of Santa Monica offered to do the surgery, and an anonymous donor offered the $4,600 it would have cost to cover the guards and hospital fees. Both requests were denied, with the state prison officials deeming the procedure too risky. He famously took part in a study conducted by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in their pursuit of profiling violent and sexual offenders, and was a notable contributor to John Douglas Anne Burgess, Alan Burgess, and Robert Ressler's book, Crime Classification Manual, a standard system for investigating and classifying violent crimes, which is basically an encyclopedia for violent and sexual crimes and how to profile those who commit them. In 1995, John Douglas gifted a signed copy of the book to Ed as a thank you. I will paraphrase here, but John said of Ed, "We ended up doing several lengthy interviews with Kemper over the years, each one informative, each one harrowing in its detail. Here is a man who had coldly butchered intelligent young women in the prime of their lives, yet I would be less than honest if I didn't admit that I liked Ed. I don't want him out walking the streets, and in his most lucid moments, neither does he. It's hard to imagine any circumstance under which they should be released to the public again." And all I can say to that is that Mr. John Douglas, whom I adore, is a far more emotionally evolved person than I am. Ed also participated in the Books for Blind program that Vacaville started in the 1960s. He spent more than 5,000 hours in the recording booth, more than any other prisoner to take part in the project. Of the many books he recorded, some notables were Star Wars, The Rosary Murders, Women of Eden, and Flowers in the Attic. He has also lent his voice to a few children's books, like The Trumpet of the Swan, Stuart Little, and Charlotte's Web, which is just so fucking unsettling. In California, the minimum time served for a first-degree murder conviction is 25 years, and Ed's sentences were to be served concurrently, not consecutively, meaning that he would have the possibility for parole. Ed has been eligible for parole 14 times. He has waived his right to a hearing 4 times and been denied the other 10. He will not be eligible again until July of 2031, when he will be 82 years old. One of the things that I have always wanted to ensure in telling these stories is that the victims are never reduced to mere tick marks on a killer's timeline. They were so much more than that. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends. They were women with hopes and dreams and lives still waiting to unfold. Each and every one of Ed Kemper's victims was an individual, a person with their own story, cut short in the most unimaginable way. While Ed is the central figure in this horrifying story, it's important to remember that he was the brutal and senseless end to theirs. They should be remembered not just for their tragic deaths, but for who they were, how they lived, and the futures they should have had. Mary Ann Pesch, born on August 19, 1953, was an exceptional young woman full of promise. She was a gifted student, a standout on her high school debate team, and an accomplished skier with dreams of one day competing for a spot on the Olympic team. Known for her warmth, kindness, and adventurous spirit, Mary Ann was someone who lit up any room she entered. She had a genuine love for life, and her infectious positivity made her beloved by all who knew her. Anita Luchessa, born on October 29, 1953, was a bright and engaging young woman with a strong sense of community. She was active in numerous school clubs, including German Club, Science Club, Yell Leaders, and the American Field Service, which is a volunteer organization for international student exchange. Outgoing and always ready to lend an ear, Anita was a source of support and laughter to her friends. Her sharp intellect and infectious humor made her a wonderful and comforting person to be around. Aiko Koo, born on May 25, 1957, was a talented and driven young girl with a love for the arts. At just 12 years old, she performed at the United Nations birthday anniversary party in Oakland, showcasing her skill in ballet and Korean dance. Aiko shared a special, inseparable bond with her mother, who worked at the University of California Library. Aiko's caring nature and deep loyalty to her friends are what people remember most about her. A sweet and dependable soul whose presence brought warmth and put others at ease. Cindy Shaw, born on August 4, 1955, was a young woman full of potential and ambition. She was weighing her options about her future career, torn between becoming a teacher or a policewoman. In the meantime, Cindy worked as a live-in babysitter, caring for 6 children over the years and excelling in her studies. She was a kind-hearted and energetic person, full of life and enthusiasm. She had big dreams, including buying her first car with the money she was saving. Cindy's fun-loving spirit and compassion made her someone who could always be counted on for support and joy. Rosalind Thorpe, born on September 30th, 1949, was an out lesbian in a time when it wasn't widely accepted, and was a passionate advocate for women's rights. She was also a dedicated student of linguistics and psychology. Known as Roz to her friends, she had a playful, warm personality and was beloved for her sense of humor. Her famous homemade pies were the highlight at every potluck, and she was always the life of the party. Her mother remembers her daughter's big bear hugs and how much she would miss them. A fun-loving, spirited woman, Rosalind's kindness and zest for life made her an irreplaceable friend. Alice Liu, born on February 5, 1952, was a focused and driven young woman in her junior year of college, just days away from her 21st birthday. Alice was a dedicated student who had originally dreamed of becoming a teacher, but had recently shifted her focus to Oriental studies. She was actively involved in several clubs, including the Future Teachers Club, Creative Writing Club, and French Club. She was known for her strong work ethic and thoughtful nature. Alice had an inspiring drive to succeed and was deeply respected by those who knew her for both her intelligence and her compassionate heart. Clarnell Strandberg, born on March 19, 1921, is someone we already know was a downright terrible mother to Ed. After her death, her behavior was analyzed by psychiatrists who believed she may have been suffering from borderline personality disorder, which can be marked by intense episodes of depression, anxiety, and outbursts of anger. Had Clarnell gotten proper help for her mental health, it's likely that her relationship with Ed would have been completely different. She was, however, said to have been a distinctly different mother to her daughters, who she is said to have loved dearly. Clarnell was known to be a hard-working and determined woman, resilient in the face of personal challenges, and always there for others in their time of need. Sally Hallett, born on October 19, 1913, was a gentle and compassionate woman who adored her 2 sons. A best friend to Clarnell, Sally enjoyed traveling with her and was known for her generous spirit and calm demeanor. Though she was often reserved, Sally's kindness and empathy were unmatched. She was someone who could always be relied on for support and was remembered as loyal, dependable, and an overall loving presence in the lives of those who were lucky enough to know her. Each of these women had so much more to give the world. Their lives were full of promise, love, and potential, and their loss left an irreplaceable void. They will be remembered for the beautiful lives they lived, the joy they shared, and the love they spread to those around them. Over the years, Ed has said that of all of his victims, he felt some guilt over Aiko, but Mary Ann is the one he felt truly remorseful for. He says that he can still see her beautiful blue eyes and that they haunt him. Good. Fucking good. Sorry, not sorry, but I want him haunted. I want him to see her eyes and the eyes of every person he hurt, including those that are still here mourning. I hope thoughts of the pain he caused torment him every single minute of every single day. As of this recording, Ed Kemper is 76 years old and incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, California. He suffers from coronary artery disease, for which he has a pacemaker, and has diabetes that has resulted in him having one of his toes amputated. He suffered a stroke in 2015 and is currently wheelchair-bound. And that, my friends, is the end of our 3-part exploration into Ed Kemper, also known as the Co-Ed Killer. Like I mentioned at the top of the episode, the show will be taking a short break. If you're in need of a true crime fix, please check out Crime to Burn or Like Mother Like Murder. If you want to add some spookiness to your day, check out Thick Thighs and Creepy Vibes or The Dead Podcast. And last but not least, if you're needing an extra dose of queerness, the Simply Sapphic podcast is launching on January 9th. Give them all a follow, and never fear, my dear. Criminally Nerdy will be back before you know it. That's all I've got for you today, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. If you would like to make a donation to the podcast, there will be a support the show link in the show notes, or you can go to buymeacoffee.com/criminallynerdypodcast. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and TikTok at Criminally Nerdy Podcast, Blue Sky at Criminally Nerdy, or shoot me an email anytime at criminallynerdypodcast@gmail.com. Till next time, keep it nerdy. I didn't know I could get gayer, and then here comes Villanelle, making me gayer. He's an angry elf. God, I can't fucking say this shit. Ugh. Nope. Look, it wasn't my worst Wednesday night. Blech. That's not what it is. Fuck. Meanwhile, I'm starting phase 2, which is me sitting on a stool while 40 gray aliens take turns gently batting my knuckers around. Am I slap happy? Why are you using the turn signal? You're literally telling them where we're going. I think he was the lookout. A frest. That's a word. That's how you say January. That was fantastic. Okay. Bueller. Damn it. Aw, there's the baby boo. Blah, 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 blah. I have so much respect for you that it has circled around to objectification.